Hey everybody, we are continuing on with our fruit people. So I can't remember exactly where we got to last time, but I think at this point I'm now rendering all the characters. So I've roughly designed them out, and I talked roughly about how I'm trying to take the most obvious elements from all of the fruit and carry that through to their design. So at this point it's now about blending in where I've used Photo Bash and making sure that I'm popping out the areas of the design that are most important, and essentially hiding the use of photos so that we don't get that strange mix between very accurate and detailed areas of the image and then the areas which I've painted in manually. To help with this a lot, I do often use brushes with some texture, and sometimes I'll put in the color dynamics as well, which gives you this variation across the image. Now, the thing that I just did there, where I stretched it out, added some blue, did a bunch of things that I wouldn't normally do. It's a process which I've started to call like an overpaint for yourself. So essentially, when I find that I do overpaints for other people's artwork, the thing that really stands out is how willing I am to try something big, try a really big change, and disregard any of the details or shapes or whatever it is that looks appealing about the image. Completely disregard those as I paint over the top. And the nice thing about doing that is, of course, you end up finding solutions which are probably going to change and push your image towards the better far faster than trying to just push around small details. Oftentimes it's what the image really needs. And as you can see there, what I did is I just merged everything so that I could no longer edit individual bits. I was no longer concerned with, oh, I need to be careful that I don't lose this layer because it might be useful later on. And instead I could just edit everything at once. And I wanted to see, would this look better if it was taller? Would this look better if it had this strong complementary color? And it really helps with a lot of paintings that I do, especially landscapes, where I'm trying to keep foreground, background, midground elements separate because it's so much more useful that way when you're trying to make larger changes later on, or you're trying to put atmosphere between these layers. But you just cannot think straight. You cannot think about what the bigger changes you need to do are when you're still restricted by trying to be less destructive with your workflow. So a really good technique is, merge everything, and maybe even merge, if it's a design like this, merge it with the background too, so that you're even not concerned about the silhouette, and start painting on top, rip chunks apart, move them around, and push for a solution which you wouldn't have thought of before. So the idea I brought up earlier of being destructive, if you actively try and be destructive with your work, but push it towards something which has more impact, then you are far more likely to find a solution that was essentially hidden from you before, that you just couldn't see because you were desperately trying to keep everything organized, keep your layers tidy, all this kind of stuff. And also just keep work that you've already done. Like a lot of the time, if you've spent a while painting a face or something, and it starts to feel nice, it looks alright, you know something's wrong with it, but you've spent a good amount of time painting it, and maybe you've even had some reference, then it's really hard to essentially disregard that work, get rid of it. It's sort of work that it's time wasted, I suppose. You could look at it that way, where you've spent a lot of time trying to make something look good, and you want to keep that direction, because otherwise it feels like a loss, just like a net loss if you get rid of it. Try and see it instead as a push towards the right direction. Ultimately, it was a necessary step to find the solution that was actually better. Like, if you look at the overpaint that you've done, and it removes a good chunk of the face, or it basically requires a complete redraw of it, maybe it's a change of angle, where you can't just fiddle things around in Liquify or something and skew it. You need to look at that as part of the process, in the same way that when you start a painting, you have to sketch it out before you can start painting on top of it. It's part of the process, and you would never have got to the painting without it. And looking at it this way, especially if you record your paintings, and then you can look back and really dig deep into why the previous version didn't work, I think you're going to learn so much more than if you start being precious with your artwork. It kind of leads into the idea that any piece that you're doing now is really just practice for the next piece that you're doing. And as you get better and better, this becomes more obvious, because you look back at the old work that you were very precious and very proud of at the time, and that just does not stand up to your quality today. And it becomes very clear that you shouldn't have been worrying about those pieces at the time. So it's really worth just making sure that you have that in mind when you're trying to make criticisms of your own artwork, because it's very easy to do that for someone else, but for some reason, for a long time, I just could not get into that headspace when critiquing my own work. So yeah, even if you have to literally save it out as an image and then drag that image into a new Photoshop document to make it feel like you're doing a paint over of someone else, then do it. Because a lot of the time, that setup can be what actually gets you into the right frame of mind for it. Anyway, it whizzed past and I didn't really have a chance to cover it, but the character here, I might even skip back to it. It was a great example of how I am roughing in the lighting when I do these pieces. So I've taken all of the base values from the image, and I'm quite concerned with getting an image to look interesting with purely its local colors, because ultimately that's the design. For a character like this, which you could see running around in a game or maybe being animated, you want to make sure that the design underneath, which should somewhat be absent from any sort of lighting scenario they could be in, or how close up or how far away you see them from, they should always be interesting. So here, the layout of where the white elements are versus the green versus the red, that's very important. And if it can look appealing at this stage, then hopefully you can make it look appealing in any lighting scenario. So once I've done that, you see I just copy the layer. The one below I darken, and depending on what lighting scenario I want to put it in, it will depend what adjustments you make. But typically, the lower layer you can desaturate slightly and then push towards blue with color balance. And then the layer above, you can, typically it will be much closer to the original colors you had, but you can most of the time brighten it a bit. And if it's in sunlight or something, then maybe push it towards that warmer yellowy tone. Then you just make a clipping mask of that, and you can paint inside that mask where you want the light to hit. And this is really useful because it means that you can add and remove light constantly. And overall, you have a very, very consistent effect of light as it hits the image. If you were trying to paint in these areas of light manually, you would constantly be trying to choose the exact right color for that area of the image. And where you start to be inconsistent in how one color becomes the same color but in the light, that's when lighting can start to look unrealistic. Or maybe not unrealistic, because I'm not trying to make this look like a photograph, but it starts to be far less believable. The eye is ultimately very sensitive to the subtle differences between colors. And so this is a really nice shortcut to firstly understand the importance of that, and also to make it easier for you if you're trying to set up a sort of process for this kind of work. The one thing that I will caveat that with is that because you're blending directly between the light and the dark, any point which is sort of half opacity between light and dark, Photoshop's blending with colors will always desaturate them. So in real life, certainly on things which have any sort of subsurface scattering, like on skin, the transition between the light and the shadow always goes through a brighter version of that color. If it's going from, like on skin, for example, it may go from a bright yellow down to like a deep red. And in between, you need a pop of orange, because if you blend it just like with a 50% opacity, which is essentially how Photoshop understands it, then you get a desaturated in between. So it becomes orange on the color wheel, but it's a linear, it's almost like if you imagine the color wheel as a circle and you draw a line that connects 2 points on that line, Photoshop will find literally the point in the middle, which isn't the most saturated version of that color. It's a desaturated one, because the further into the middle of that circle you get, the less saturated it is. And so what you need to make sure you do is that you actually follow the curve of the color wheel around the outside, rather than just skipping through the middle. But otherwise, it's a very, very useful technique, and certainly a very useful one when trying to learn how light actually affects an object, and the importance of consistency of lighting in a scene. The other fun thing is that you can start layering on extra light sources. So if you wanted a maybe a cool blue light from below. Duplicate the layer again, tint it to and brighten it to be that light source, and then you can mask that in on top. Anyway, that's it for this video. I'll see you in the next one.